By the end of this video, you're going to ask why he wasn't caught earlier. Every time I look at the evidence, I find it hysterical. It's just so laughably out in the open. Who let this go unchecked for so long? Was no one watching? Was no one asking him the tough questions? Was everyone too blinded by the glory that they hitched their cart to him and hoped for the best? Partially, yes. But if the walls around you were on fire and a bucket of water showed up out of nowhere, would you question how it got there? Or would you use the bucket? On March 10th, 2000, the Nasdaq index reached its then peak of 5,048. A peak it wouldn't hit again until 2015. You've heard of the dot-com bubble, right? At the turn of the millennium, investments in internet businesses were at an all-time high. However, when it became clear that many of these kind of silly businesses were never going to turn a profit, the market crashed. Here's the part you probably didn't know. A year later, in 2001, there was another crash, the telecom crash. It was 10 times bigger than the dot-com bubble. See, the internet doesn't just run on its own. You need hardware to power the internet. You need millions of switches and thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable. And when the Clinton administration passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996, companies invested billions of dollars, most of it financed by debt. Don't ask me how that works, so they could be part of the world's 3G infrastructure. But when the dot-com bubble burst, which provided much of the funding for these networks, the telecom industry imploded. Companies like Cisco, Intel, and Oracle lost 80% of their market value. And believe it or not, those were the lucky ones. If you weren't declaring bankruptcy, you were laying off the equivalent of a small town. That may sound like I'm exaggerating, but a company from my hometown of Ottawa, JDS Uniphase, went from employing 10,000 workers to 580. Lucent Technologies, who owned Bell Labs at the time, happened to be one of the lucky ones. In one day, Lucent's stock fell by 30%. Between 2000 and 2002, Lucent's stock had fallen by a factor of 40. In the years prior to the crash, Lucent had spent a decent portion of its profits buying up other, smaller competing companies. As soon as the crash hit, it did the opposite, splitting up into spin-offs like Avaya, Azure Systems, or outright selling entire departments to competitors. Hendrik's department was one of the few to stay on with Bell Labs. It was life or death for the remaining researchers. Half of the light bulbs were literally being removed from sockets to save money on power, and the beloved technical library was slated to close, much to the frustration of the staff. Joke memos circulated about how printing with any font larger than 12 points was forbidden. Older employees, who tended to have the largest salaries, were offered voluntary retirement packages. In Hendrik's department, over the course of 4 years, the number of researchers fell from 114 to 56. In the middle of all this, 9/11 happened, within driving distance of Murray Hill, New Jersey. You could definitely say that morale was not the highest at Bell Labs. This was followed a month later by a near complete shakeup of the executive board of Lucent. Each and every department head now had to make a case to investors why they shouldn't have their funding cut. If you couldn't find a way to turn your project into a product, you might be out of a job. The materials science division at Bell Labs was perhaps the most physicsy out of all the departments. The research they did there was important and fundamental to discoveries down the line, but unlikely to lead to a new product anytime soon. If any department was first on the chopping block, it was that one. But if it had a breakout star who was making breakthroughs around the clock, hell yeah. Why wouldn't Bell Labs want to publicize that? Hendrik was a bucket of water in an inferno. By all accounts, Hendrik was not an arrogant man. He was shy, tended not to talk up his own work, and was reluctant to accept enthusiastic praise from colleagues.
The summer before I started my PhD, so I just graduated with my bachelor's degree, I spent a summer at Bell Labs in Murray Hill. And that was like the summer where Schön was like, taking off, like all his papers were coming out. And yeah, when he was at Bell Labs, when I met him there, played hockey with him, was very friendly and people liked him, and it was like you would have never guessed that he was up to something like this.
No one had it in for Hendrik. He didn't have enemies. It's probably one of the reasons it went so far. If he had been confrontational, someone would have gotten mad and had the incentive to go after him. He also wasn't in it for the money. He drove a mid-range car, rarely dressed up, and didn't go out to fancy restaurants or anything like that. At one point, he had several paychecks piling up at his desk in Murray Hill, and when Klock offered to deposit them, stating that one was missing, Hendrik didn't seem concerned. The one concern he did seem to have was keeping his full-time position at Bell Labs, and with the uncertain financial state of the company, his productivity would likely be the deciding factor. During a bachelor's degree, there tends to be an emphasis on getting the right answer, so you can wrap your head around the fundamentals. As you advance in years though, moving on through your master's and later your PhD, the focus has shifted from getting the result you expected to explaining why you got the less convenient result that you did see. Somewhere during his PhD, this just didn't click for Hendrik. Hendrik's overly literal interpretation of physics was sending him down a dangerous path.
After this happened, I was like, had all his papers, right? So I started wondering, like, did he do this in his PhD thesis? And there are a couple of instances in his PhD thesis papers where things don't add up,
Even from his time at the University of Constance, he tended, even at that time, to alter or muddle his original data in order to make the presentation of his results clearer. Hendrik developed an aversion to outliers, to noise. It's as if he viewed them as something to be eliminated from his data and not a fundamental reality of his experiments. He would replace data with best fit lines. He would smooth data out, or he would connect data from two different samples as if they were from the same sample. Hendrik was fabricating nearly all of it. He wasn't plagiarizing, he wasn't cherry picking, he was making it all up because he fundamentally did not grasp the scientific method. Hendrik learned early on that not all his work was going to be publishable. That's part of the brutal reality of academia. But if he couldn't put something out soon, it might cost him his job, like it did hundreds of his coworkers. So he made one essential change to his scientific process. He did it in reverse. He decided what results he wanted to see and constructed the data backwards until he had a full set of graphs.
And so he didn't really introduce any new physics. All he had to do was go look through the semiconductor solid state physics book or a semiconductor device book and say, okay, my stuff's going to do that. And I think that's what he was doing for like a lot of these papers. Everybody knew about quantum Hall effect. Everybody knew about how to make a laser, a photovoltaic. Like the physics of all of that was well understood. And so all he did was say, okay, now this is working in this material. Like before it worked in silicon, I'm now making, because I made these molecular crystals with high mobilities, and I can inject a lot of charge into them, I can do all this stuff that silicon used to be able to do, or other materials, gallium arsenide, for example.
That's why he was so successful in every area he dipped his toes into. He knew what results would excite the scientific community, get them talking. He just needed to make that data seem plausible, and the way he did it was genius. When people would come to Hendrik with questions or concerns, he would change his data to match their expectations. Here's an example. Early in 2000, Hendrik was reporting that he'd observed superconductivity in molecules of carbon-60. He showed beautiful curves where the resistance plummeted to zero as the temperature approached 11 Kelvin. Harold Huang, a colleague, asked Hendrik if he was sure that it was genuine superconductivity, or if his measurement setup might be seeing a short circuit, which is when an unexpected electrical connection occurs. Hendrik asked Harold what experiments he should perform that would convince him it was indeed superconductivity. Harold gave him some follow-ups he could try, and Hendrik came back soon after, claiming he did one, even though he hadn't. Hendrik was more than happy to accept feedback because it meant he had new ammunition to make his fraud more convincing. This tendency to agree with everything made it impossible for others to track their own progress. At one point, Klock switched his crystal setup to use hydrogen gas instead of argon, hoping it would improve the growth conditions for his crystals. When Hendrik reported back to him that he saw an increased conductivity, Klock assumed his switch had led to the improvement. It was only later that he realized Hendrik was just artificially reporting better results because he knew that's what Klock expected to see. Peter Littlewood, who had previously spent summers at Bell Labs, described the situation this way. You would say something, and then it would happen. You would get caught up in the progress of the subject. For a long time, I didn't believe it could have been fraud because I didn't believe one person could make it all up. Then I realized we all made it up. Littlewood later said that Hendrik Schön was the best listener of any experimental physicist in the world. Hendrik would publish a new result, perhaps with a bizarre, unexpected trend. Someone would suggest an explanation, and then, miraculously, the next few papers Hendrik produced would align suspiciously well with that proposed theory. Although this worked for a time, people gradually caught on to this small tactic of Hendrik's. The problem, Forrest said, was that Hendrik Schön seemed to be expecting the rest of the scientific community to do his heavy lifting for him, reproducing work that he hadn't done very carefully to start with, and failing to provide a clear interpretation of his results. Over the years, rumors have circulated that there were in fact negative reviews of Hendrik's submissions that were ignored by journals because they were more concerned with publishing exciting, attention-grabbing headlines. This is nearly impossible to confirm because reviewers are always kept anonymous. Nature has stated that in general, they were willing to discuss the specifics of the review process after a paper is published, but they declined to do so in the wake of the Schön scandal because they, and I quote, lost many of the records related to their handling of Hendrik's manuscripts. Science, on the other hand, has publicly stated that they will blacklist any reviewer who speaks publicly about papers they've reviewed. Eugenie Reich, in her 2009 book on the scandal, did extensive research and ended up obtaining info regarding reviews for 17 of Hendrik's papers, and none of them were blatantly negative. What she did find was many positive, but also conditional acceptances. And Hendrik used his natural, agreeable personality to exploit the hell out of these conditional acceptances. Many reviewers, despite being impressed, had specific concerns or suggestions. In principle, these reviewers were saying, if you make these changes, or clarify these things, I think this is publishable. Hendrik loved using relative units on his graphs rather than absolute units. So for example, let's say you have a current versus voltage graph. In some cases, it's more useful to just put the current as a percentage of the max value, rather than a specific number of amps. That's because it's the shape of the curves and not the exact numbers that is of interest. Now, this is fine for one or two graphs, but at some point you do need to include exact numbers. The issue for Hendrik is that exact numbers are way harder for him to fake and would just expose him to more specific questions about his work. The more specific a question, the harder it is to bluff. For one of his papers, a reviewer made this exact complaint. He gave an overall positive review, but asked for the inclusion of exact numbers. Hendrik received this critique, went ahead and included exact values in amps, and the next time that person saw the paper, it was already in print. To his surprise, he found that the current Schön reported having measured across the device was unrealistically small. This should have been impossible to measure. Suddenly, a paper that he had recommended enthusiastically for publication was beginning to unravel. Hendrik was always careful to avoid responding aggressively. He would write back in a polite, formal manner, asking for advice and suggestions from the reviewers, acknowledging their critiques as valid. But when he resubmitted his manuscripts to the journals, he almost never made any meaningful changes. When in doubt, Hendrik's most popular tactic was to cheerfully include further experiments will be needed, and he was off the hook. By acknowledging his work left many unanswered questions, he managed to skirt by the review process. In one particularly sneaky case, Hendrik submitted a paper on his molecular transistor to Nature. One reviewer found his claim of molecular scale computing to be exaggerated, and that it should be deleted from the final submission. Hendrik got around this by saying the necessary data to make that claim was going to be in a soon-to-be-published paper in Science. He was playing two competing journals off of each other. This lack of specifics regarding his experimental setup also made it harder for other researchers to try and replicate his work. If just one other lab could reproduce Hendrik's work, it would dispel any doubt that Hendrik was taking home a Nobel Prize.
But at that point, nobody else had sort of duplicated anything yet. So we felt like, okay, we can still, maybe we'll be the first ones to be second place to him. And that would still, he would leave us some stuff to do.
But by 2002, it had been over 2 full years since Hendrik's breakout paper on high conductivity pentacene, and not a single research group had been able to get anywhere close to his conductivity values. In physics, 2 years is an eternity. What was one man doing differently that dozens of other labs couldn't? It's worth a reminder that throughout this whole story, Hendrik remained a German citizen, which means that to legally work in the United States, he needed a visa. He got one for his 4-month internship, then he went back to Germany for 4 months to finish his PhD. To return to Bell Labs, though, he had to reapply for a new visa, since the terms of his employment would have been updated. He was no longer an intern, but a postdoc on a 2-year contract. As we learned earlier, no postdoc at Bell Labs is guaranteed a full-time job, especially given the financial circumstances. But Hendrik was the rare exception to the rule, and in December of 2000, he officially got his full-time contract. But again, because the terms of his employment had changed, he was obligated to return to Germany and apply for another visa. A process that lasted 5 months. During this time, he still worked for Bell Labs. He just worked remotely in his old lab at the University of Constance. Here's where it all starts to come into focus. This 5-month period in Germany is responsible for almost all of his breakthroughs in 2001. Hendrik received no shortage of praise from his managers at Bell Labs, but given the economic state of the company, chief among them was the fact that he was cheap. He rarely, if ever, made funding requests to his department directors, and yet he still managed to make several breakthroughs. This became so prevalent that other employees were even chastised in performance reviews, and told that they should work more cost-effectively. So the fact that he was A, cheap, B, in a separate country, and C, a breakout scientific rock star meant that Hendrik had little to no oversight and was largely left to his own devices. Besides the organic crystals provided to Hendrik by Christian Klock, he didn't need much. The University of Constance had every piece of equipment he could ask for. Most of his work was slapping metal electrodes on top of crystals and measuring the current going through them. All of that could be done at a simple lab bench. This sort of thing was stupid simple, which meant that nearly any rival research lab could be doing the exact same tests at little cost. As the story goes, anytime Hendrik was asked what his secret ingredient was, he would always give the exact same answer: aluminum oxide. General rule of thumb when making transistors: the more electrons you've got flowing, the more conductive it is. So you'll have millions, maybe even billions of electrons flowing back and forth in a confined channel. And since Hendrik was also making superconductors, he was squeezing absurd amounts of electrons into the same space. Careful though, that's a lot of pent-up volts that need somewhere to go. The critical element here is the top insulating layer. You want the electrons flowing this way, but they really want to burst out this way. You need a material that can act as a shield that can withstand that buildup of charge. If it's too weak, the electrons punch a hole through it, maybe even setting fire to your chip. Typical transistors use SiO2 as their insulator, but the charge densities Hendrik was reporting needed something stronger, which is why he used aluminum oxide. This fact on its own wasn't innovative on Hendrik's part. The remarkable thing about his results was that even with a stronger insulator, he claimed to observe charge densities in the range of 70 to 80 million volts per centimeter. That's a lot of volts. These fields were so strong they'd annihilate a regular transistor, and is about 5 times higher than what every other lab said they could handle.
At least with the molecular crystal work, there was nothing that people said, oh, this can't be done, you're violating. The only thing was the aluminum oxide. There was a lot of skepticism. We had an expert at Cornell who was an expert on aluminum oxide, and when I told him that he was sputtering aluminum oxide and getting a volt per nanometer, the guy just was flabbergasted. His response was like, that guy's an effing genius.
As long as no one else could achieve the same charge densities, he had plausible deniability that he was doing something better than everyone else. Here's where the big miscommunication came into play. When researchers asked Batlogg how they could make high-quality aluminum oxide, Batlogg implied that they would need to invest in high-quality sputtering equipment. This led people to believe that Bell Labs had a high-quality sputtering facility, when in reality, Hendrik was traveling back and forth between Bell Labs and his old PhD lab at the University of Constance to use the fairly old and definitely not state-of-the-art sputtering machine there. Isn't that interesting? All of Hendrik's key breakthroughs can be traced back to one machine that wasn't in his place of work and required a 10-hour flight to get to. Very interesting. By this point, Hendrik was a bit of a celebrity and often received emails from labs around the country asking for advice on replicating his experiments. Colleagues continually pestered him about how he was sputtering the aluminum oxide, since this was the experimental step nobody seemed to be able to replicate.
But anyways, I said, I'm working at Cornell University with Paul McEwen on organic field effect transistors. We've become interested in these materials after your recent success. The quality of the gates you use are of extremely remarkable quality, and I was wondering if you could provide us with some information on how such strong fields are generated at the crystal dielectric interface without breakdown of the Al2O3. His response was, unfortunately, there's no detailed publication, but I'll try to give some info. And he gave very detailed, though. We used 99.995% pure stoichiometric target, 3-inch diameter, give us the supplier, the sputterer system, the plasma, the pressures. I just gave up. I told my advisor, think at some point I said, I think I'm going to leave this project. Can I work on something else? Because this guy is just too good.
Hendrik must have realized that people would eventually catch on because he started rewriting history to lend himself credibility. Rumors circulated that Hendrik had mastered sputtering machines when he used them for his PhD thesis, which wasn't true. He didn't use them for his PhD thesis, but Hendrik would support those rumors when asked. The logic at the time was that if there were any imperfections in the aluminum oxide, it would disintegrate at high voltages, so it needed to be really, really pure. But what didn't make sense was how Hendrik, who was working on some underutilized piece of equipment in the corner of an obscure German laboratory, was somehow producing better quality oxide than labs with much better equipment. The only other explanation was that there was something specific about the Constance machine, like a unique combination of atmosphere and other chemicals that just happened to make a perfect oxide deposit. It was just too absurd to be believable. It got so bad that at one point colleagues were begging him to publish an entire paper just on the aluminum oxide process. He finally relented, tediously compiling results at dozens of deposition rates and pressures in an unpublished document he circulated around to those who asked. Although he did submit it, it never officially got published by a journal. But much like a lot of things in this story, it would still come back to haunt him. It's impossible to know for sure, but it's thought that the first recorded suspicion of fraud came over a year before the scandal went public. It was in May 2001 in an email from Bob Lawlin, a theoretical physicist. He perhaps felt bold enough to make this claim because, well, he had worked for Bell Labs many years ago and had no problem criticizing his former place of work. But if I had to guess, it was mainly because he had a Nobel Prize under his belt. Bob Lawlin had serious doubts about the deposition of the aluminum oxide. His knowledge of the physics of insulators didn't match up with what he'd heard from Batlogg. Lawlin even publicly criticized Batlogg in an August 2000 seminar, claiming that the data he was showing was of far too narrow a range to be meaningful. In the summer of 2001, he went so far as to approach Takehiko Ishiguro with his concerns, who then went on to publish one of the first critiques of Hendrik's work. Bob Lawlin had a reputation for being outspoken and highly skeptical in general, so his word alone would not have been enough to spark widespread suspicion. Doubt? Sure, lots of people were confused about Hendrik's exact methods, but fraud? Not quite yet. So why not? Why was there such an aversion to speaking up when so many people either couldn't reproduce or didn't even believe Hendrik's results? Because of the taboo. Science is a difficult line of work, and it only gets done because of collaboration. Jumping to accusations right out of the gate when there might be a much more innocent explanation is never advisable. Not to mention the potential to get it wrong, accusing an innocent person is risky and might turn into a public scandal that can drag on for years. This is made even harder the more famous the accused is. You wouldn't just be accusing Hendrik. By extension, you'd be accusing Batlogg. You'd be accusing the entire institution of Bell Labs. Without a smoking gun, indisputable evidence of fraud, it's an uphill battle where it's your credibility against an institution's, a scientific dynasty. If you happen to be wrong, you deal a permanent blow to your own career. If you happen to be right, well, you did the right thing. But every new case of fraud erodes public trust in science and makes it harder to get funding and resources. Not to mention it can lead to fear-mongering about vaccines and 5G cell towers. And even if fraud is a possibility, it's never the first thing people jump to. Maybe he made a mistake. Maybe he just misinterpreted. Maybe I'm not as good at science as I thought I was. As crazy as it sounds, Hendrik evaded discovery for so long because people kept giving him the benefit of the doubt. Getting a paper out of Bell Labs was supposed to be more difficult than a university. In academia, I can write up and submit a manuscript to a journal without having to show it to anyone or getting anyone's approval. At Bell Labs, though, my draft paper was then sent to somebody else in the division, not directly connected with the work, for a once-over before it could be submitted. The assumption was that these checks were being performed on Hendrik's work. In truth, this wasn't happening. Most of the time, Hendrik would run his papers by Batlogg and no one else, sometimes ignoring the many experts in the building who would have been able to provide invaluable commentary. In one case, a co-worker, Art Ramirez, approached Hendrik with an organic crystal called perylene. He expressed interest in measuring its electrical properties, which was dangerous for Hendrik because it meant someone would be double-checking his results. Hendrik tried to dissuade Ramirez by claiming he had already worked with perylene before, but Ramirez insisted. The next week, Hendrik presented Ramirez with a freshly typed-up manuscript that reused old graphs, but with perylene swapped in for the figure title. This finally convinced Ramirez to back off. Hendrik was willing to go so far as to convince people he had articles ready to publish just to get people off his tracks. When another co-worker, David Muller, asked Hendrik if he could inspect his laser under a microscope, Hendrik said he'd bring it back from Constance on his next visit. When Hendrik later did no such thing, he told Muller he forgot it. Lucky for Hendrik, however, Muller interpreted this as Hendrik's polite way of saying, "This is my work, back off." And in an environment like Bell Labs, especially at the height of its economic troubles, this wasn't suspicious. It would make sense for Hendrik to be territorial about a huge discovery like this. Benefit of the doubt helped Hendrik in other ways. Joe Orenstein of Berkeley had his group attempt to analyze the organic crystals that Hendrik had used in his superconductivity experiments. This meant cooling the crystals close to absolute zero. Big problem though. The crystals always shattered at 100 Kelvin, nowhere close to the temperatures Hendrik was reporting. This of course was because Hendrik hadn't performed the experiment and wouldn't know the crystals would shatter, but again, rather than assume there was a problem with the Bell Labs work, Orenstein assumed either it was something wrong with his experimental process or the quality of his crystals was just not good enough. Of course, he was assuming that Hendrik was operating in good faith, which, he wasn't. This assumption often extended to how Hendrik interpreted his results as well. Hendrik was not an expert at lasers, and neither was Batlogg. Before he even published what would become his second most cited paper, there was a rather heated internal debate over what his results actually meant. In his paper, Hendrik presented two intensity versus wavelength plots, supposedly taken at two very different temperatures. Both shapes are remarkably similar Gaussian curves, which is odd enough for such different temperatures, but you'd also expect to see the graph to shift horizontally too, and that clearly hasn't happened here. In fact, Hendrik's laser spectrums were so baffling that no one could actually agree on whether Hendrik's crystal was lasing or whether it was demonstrating another effect known as superluminescence. The debate wasn't over whether Hendrik's laser data was real or not, but whether he had actually made a laser in the first place. The molecular transistor was Hendrik's final claim to fame, and it was such a bold breakthrough to fake that it ultimately led to his downfall.
Once he did the single molecule and the molecular transistor stuff, that's when there was the first hints that something was really wrong. Right away, at least my PhD advisor was suspicious of it as soon as it came out. And just the geometries just violated the laws of physics. You couldn't have a gate 20 nanometers away and a source and a drain 1 nanometer and have an electric field from this influence the junction in there.
For months, though, he managed to fend off several tough questions regarding his confusing data. IBM is one of Bell Labs' fiercest competitors. They actually hold the second place record for the most Nobel Prizes won by a private company. At one point, a collection of IBM researchers were dead set on submitting a paper to Nature that was a direct critique of the molecular transistor paper, which came just short of accusing Hendrik of fraud. Nature reached out to Hendrik and Bao for a correction. In the end, Nature decided not to publish the IBM critique, because Hendrik claimed he had performed more experiments to confirm his results weren't just a fluke, and he had an upcoming paper in another journal which would clarify some of the finer unknown details. Now, where have we heard that before? During a seminar he gave at Bell Labs, Hendrik was questioned about two molecular devices of very different sizes. Rafi Kleiman didn't believe that two devices of such different sizes could be demonstrating the same physical effect. But Hendrik jumped in to say, oh, sorry about that, that's actually a typo. Those devices are the same size. This seemed odd at the time to Kleiman, who later checked the original submitted paper and realized that they were in fact different sizes. He correctly deduced that Hendrik had lied to his face, but Kleiman assumed it was because Hendrik didn't want to escalate a public argument, having no reason to think that Hendrik had faked the data. From this same seminar, Julia Shu asked Hendrik about an image taken from a microscope. Specifically, she wanted to know which microscope he had used. Hendrik replied that it was not in fact his picture, but he took it from literature. Julia was shocked to hear this, considering Hendrik hadn't referenced anybody in the presentation, but opted not to elevate her concern since the seminar, had been relatively informal. These exchanges are prime examples of why people tended not to engage with Hendrik at public events. He either created a moving target, altering numbers on the fly, or changing his explanations in response to feedback. David Muller is quoted as saying, "Wait for it to get into print before you criticize it." This fella, Don Monroe, didn't follow that advice. He was the first person to leverage an official accusation of fraud against Hendrik Schön. Don Monroe was a scientist at the spin-off company Agere Systems, which still technically fell under the Bell Labs umbrella, so employees of the two companies often discussed their work as they ate lunch together. Since his interests were in ultra-small transistors, Monroe proposed an intercompany seminar to Hendrik, hoping to provide some feedback on his molecular transistor, or, at least a lively debate. Hendrik agreed, and as part of the seminar, he showed off the following histogram. Here you can see he's quantified the conductivity according to how many molecules were in the device. So this bin is for devices with 1 molecule, this bin is for devices with 2, 3, and so on. When fabricating many copies of the same device, you'll inevitably run into some variation in sizes, and since we're talking about the scale of individual molecules, you'd expect to see clumps of individual molecules just like this. What's weird here is that you can see a pretty clear Gaussian distribution, aka the bell curve, and that just makes no sense. Like, look at its sample size. If you count all the bins on this histogram, you get a total of 130 devices. That's nowhere near enough of a sample size to get a Gaussian this perfect. If you run the numbers, there's only a 1.2% chance he gets a fit this clean. But it gets worse. According to Hendrik, these are just the functioning devices, and those only have a yield of 10%. So assuming you take Hendrik at his word, and he manually tested every single device that he made, that's 1,300 devices. When's the last time you did 1,300 of anything? If we assume, quite generously, that he took 5 minutes to create and measure each device, that would take 108 hours, or 4.5 days, of non-stop work. This statistical anomaly didn't go unnoticed by Don Monroe, who raised his concerns to Hendrik but was quickly brushed off. 10 days later, this histogram appeared in print. Unsatisfied with Hendrik's explanations, Don Monroe escalated the matter to Hendrik's managers. He was cautious about his wording, never outright saying that fraud had been committed, but his statistical analysis of Hendrik's data very heavily implied that it was the only explanation. It turned out that even prior to this email, Hendrik's managers had been telling him to, pump the brakes on his publishing output, as concerns over his data and lack of experimental details had been rising. This resulted in at least one paper on a single electron transistor being held back from submission. Over the coming months, Hendrik was asked repeatedly if he had some explanation for the histogram ending up so symmetrical, which led to him eventually sharing a much noisier histogram that was far more believable. For his managers and Don Monroe, this was a satisfactory resolution to the matter. Again, assumption of good faith. Nobody wanted to escalate things further than they had to, especially if an explanation had been happily provided. Hendrik's manager John Rogers is quoted as saying, "While I am not averse to an investigation, any direct involvement on my part would destroy my professional relationship with Hendrik." This would be the closest Hendrik would come to being found out and still getting away with it. But in a few short months, it would all come crashing down. You remember Julia Shu? She and Lin Lu were both working in the same department as Hendrik in April of 2002. While at a conference, they were discussing a new process for fabricating circuits. By April 19th, they had enough data for a patent application, and together they visited Bell Labs' patent attorney, where they began sifting through papers on similar concepts in order to write up their patent and justify why their technique was innovative. 2 of the papers they were sifting through were on Hendrik's molecular transistor. Lin noticed that 2 of the graphs appeared oddly similar, considering that one of the devices was for a transistor with thousands of molecular layers, and the other one for only 1 or 2 layers. But it went beyond that. The noise in the graphs was identical, like down to the pixel. 2 experiments on the exact same device, at the exact same temperature, on the exact same day, should not give the same results, much less 2 completely different devices. Both Julia and Lin immediately told colleagues about the duplication. Lin went to her supervisor, Bob Willett. Now, Bob Willett, not exactly a fan of Hendrik's. Different Bob from before, mind you, that was Bob Lawlin. There's a lot of Bobs in science. For a long time now, internal tensions over the believability of Hendrik's work were beginning to boil over. 2 months earlier, Bob Willett had been awarded the $10,000 Oliver E. Buckley Condensed Matter Prize, and a symposium was being organized in his name. Bob Willett was upset to find out Hendrik was scheduled to speak, since he didn't have faith in his results, and ended up getting into a shouting match with Federico Capasso, Hendrik's department head. In the end, Capasso won out, and Hendrik spoke at the symposium. So yeah, Bob Willett, not a fan. After Lin came to him about the duplicate, he immediately went to John Rogers, Hendrik's manager. Julia, at the same time as this, went to Mark Lee, her colleague and also husband, asking him if he could think of any reason why the graphs were so similar, perhaps an artifact of the measurement setup. Mark Lee then, coincidentally, also went to Bob Willett to ask if anybody else knew about the duplication. Mark assumed that Hendrik had just made a mistake and copied in the wrong graph. Bob Willett, who already doubted Hendrik's results, assumed Hendrik had been duplicating data in several papers, as it was the only way to explain his rapid publication pace. Mark approached Hendrik about the duplicate. Hendrik looked embarrassed and admitted that, oh, looks like he made a mistake. Mark then suggested that he send a correction to Science. Mark relayed this encounter with Hendrik to Bob Willett, who then phoned one of his old postdocs, Lydia Sohn, now a professor of physics at Princeton, telling her to keep her eyes open for an upcoming correction in a particular paper of Hendrik's. Whether Bob Willett can technically be considered a whistleblower is up for debate. From his perspective, he was just informing an old student about something he thought was public knowledge, that Hendrik was issuing a correction to one of his papers. But Bob couldn't have predicted what would happen next. Now, Lydia Sohn had been suspicious of Hendrik's papers for some time now. At one point, she had discussed the molecular transistor with a colleague who was adamant that the data was fake. His evidence? The perfectly symmetrical histogram. Little did they know that an internal investigation had already been brought up and resolved over this exact figure. Even based off nothing but the vague hint from Bob Willett, Lydia quickly figured out the problem with Hendrik's paper. But it couldn't have just been a mistake. The curves in these graphs, they're identical. Hendrik had even changed several numbers, and the caption? Like, that's a lot of work to do accidentally. Lydia quickly emailed multiple colleagues at different universities and unanimously agreed there was a serious issue here. They all recommended that Lydia contact Science and Nature, since she was the only one who wasn't in the process of submitting a paper to either journal. At the same time as all of this, John Rogers, who Bob Willett had talked to directly, had been conducting his own investigation into the duplicate figures. He ended up uncovering some figures that looked similar, but not exact duplicates. He just wouldn't have known to look back as far as 2 years earlier to a completely different organic transistor that ended up being the original source for the duplicates Lydia had identified. For those keeping score, we're up to 3 exact duplicate curves for 3 completely different devices in 3 completely different papers across a span of 2 years. The discovery of the 3rd duplicate is credited to Paul McEwen at Cornell.
But I do remember coming into the lab one morning, and my PhD advisor was there. His eyes were bloodshot, and he's like, "Scott, come here. You're not going to believe this. Let me show you what I have here." And he had these 2 transparencies printed out, and there was the 2 graphs that were identical noise. And then he did this thing where he puts them over like that.
McEwen was one of the first people Lydia informed about her discovery. He showed his findings to Dan Ralph, who was on the committee for the William L. McMillan Prize, which Hendrik had nearly won in 2001, but ultimately did not get because no one had been able to replicate his results yet. But a year later, he was the clear favorite to win for 2002. McEwen's intervention is the reason Hendrik's prize letter was never sent. McEwen compiled a refined set of the 6 most compelling pieces of duplication he could find and sent it to Hendrik, John Rogers, Batlogg, and editors at Nature and Science. On May 23rd, the story broke in the New York Times. Too late to turn back now. Bell Lab's reputation was hanging by a thread, and it all depended on how they conducted their investigation. 1 report, 5 committee members, 24 accusations, 127 pages. A report that would revoke a PhD.